Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to this special edition of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan. In this series, Ralph and constitutional scholar Bruce Fein will lay out articles in the impeachment of President Donald J. Trump. Count 11, violation of the Declare War Clause.
Well, moving from the treaty clause that is embedded in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, to the Declaration of War Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. And that one is in the minds of many Americans because that's one thing they learn in high school. They learn that the authority to declare war is exclusively in the hands of the Congress. Why did the framers put it in the hands of the Congress?
Well, it was on the one hand, Ralph, it's a unanimous decision. Virtually no one. Pierce Butler had a few comments at the convention, which he renounced in South Carolina ratification debates, but it was 100% agreement. We can never trust the president to decide on war and peace because he's tempted to aggrandize power by concocting conflicts that are totally unnecessary. That's been the history of war from the beginning. It's the executive branch that's always in the front lines trying to make excuses for war because they get all the power, the money, the appointments, the history books, and all that kind of thing. And so the framers at the convention and in the discussions in the ratification debates, like James Wilson, that we can never go to war unless both the House and Senate agree, insisted that the declare war provision be entrusted exclusively to Congress. It doesn't have a conflict of interest. Congress doesn't gain anything. It's risk averse. It will not act recklessly to get us into war, which is not only hugely damaging to our civil liberties, but enormous. It bankrupts the nation as well with staggering expenditures. And that was faithfully understood by everyone. Alexander Hamilton, only Congress can take us from a state of peace to a state of war. Indeed, during the Barbary Wars under President Thomas Jefferson, he said, I can't go beyond self-defense if we're attacked, without Congress passing statutes. And there were 10 statutes passed that authorized him to go beyond self-defense. But it's important to understand that this doesn't mean that we are helpless, that we have to wait till the suicide bomber, explodes and kills tens of thousands to respond. When we are the victim of aggression, that is, the peace has already been broken by a foreign aggressor, state or non-state actor, the president can respond. That the convention said the president can respond to sudden attacks where the peace has already been broken. So it doesn't mean we have to wait until a nuclear missile actually explodes in the middle of New York or Washington, D.C., killing millions. When there's an actual or imminent aggression from a foreign country, the president can respond. But otherwise, it's got to be up to the Congress to decide. And in 229 years, Ralph, Congress has never once taken the country from peace to war. On 5 conflicts, it said, foreign aggression has already put us in a state of war. The president is authorized to respond appropriately to win the war created by others. And when we now abandon that theory, and unfortunately it's not simply Mr. Trump, it goes back at least as far as Harry Truman fighting the Korean War without any congressional authority whatsoever, after he promised the Senate that if they ratified the United Nations Charter, he would never go to war based upon the Charter because a treaty can't override the Constitution. He would come back to Congress. But he flouted that promise and went to war anyway.
On that point, Bruce Fein, this is the one area in the Constitution that has been nullified by president after president de facto. It's almost a dead clause in the Constitution. And let me ask you to elaborate that, because Donald J. Trump, as you'll point out very shortly, keeps saying, well, other presidents have gone to war the way I wish to go to war, just by my own decision. And it's important to tell our audience, when was the last time there was a formal declaration of war in the United States?
It was right after Pearl Harbor. We haven't had Congress declaring war or otherwise directing the president to use military force. We've either had Congress do nothing or Congress basically giving away its power, which they aren't entitled to do, and say, we don't want to decide on war and peace. Here, President, you decide whether you think you want to use military force and run wars, whether it's in Vietnam or Panama or Iraq or otherwise, to escape accountability for the decision.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what the framers didn't want. They said, we can never entrust the war power to the president because of the conflict of interest. They will get us into all sorts of crazy wars.
Okay, 2 points here. The first point is Congress tried to dilute its authority to declare war with something called the War Powers Act. Can you quickly describe that?
Yeah. The War Powers Resolution in 1973. It's kind of a very odd provision because it says we really aren't trying to change anything that the Constitution has already decided between Congress and the president. Well, if that's true, then why'd you pass it? But when they passed the resolution, it gives a hint that the president can fight wars on their own up to 60 days. You can imagine with modern technology, 60 days, you could destroy the whole world. And they've never enforced the War Powers Resolution. Presidents have continually said it's unconstitutional, and Congress has never challenged that particular provision. And I want to show it's analogous, I think, what Congress has done here in trying to give away responsibility because they think it protects them from incumbent challenges to the line item veto, when the Congress said, well, we don't want to make cuts. We don't want to close tax loopholes, or contributors may be angered. And so we'll give a line item veto to the president. And the Supreme Court in Clinton said, New York, you can't give that away. There's certain legislative duties you have to exercise because the whole purpose of assigning the legislative power to Congress because it has an institutional dynamic that's different than the executive branch, and it's not going to be as reckless because they are accountable to the people.
Meaning they'll have public hearings, they'll have witnesses. People around the country would get more of exactly why Congress is going where it's going, unlike the secretive White House surrounding itself with national security camouflage. But how about this? George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, they invaded Iraq and blew it apart with all the costs and deaths and injuries without any declaration of war. Barack Obama, incited by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, in effect declared war against Libya and toppled that regime, which is still producing violent consequences in Libya and surrounding African nations. Donald J. Trump has never really started a major war. Why do you think he's violating the Declaration of War Authority of Congress, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11?
Well, it's simply because somebody else got away with it. It doesn't mean that it's okay for you to do it. I mean, if that were true, and maybe the analogy is not all that proximate, but think of the Me Too movement. For long years, you got away with sexually harassing and assaulting women. Then you apply the law now, and somebody can say, well, we got away for a long time, apply the law now. The same is true, Ralph, in a different kind of way with Jim Crow laws. We had 100 years. Oh, well, we were able to segregate and disenfranchise blacks for so long, you shouldn't make it. Don't now try and apply the law. It's been there for 100 years. The last thing I would want to do is exculpate Bush, Cheney, and Obama, because indeed, for the reasons that you've advanced, I attempted to try to get articles of impeachment introduced, because the war power, when it's usurped, is the most dangerous to all of our constitutional liberties. In times of war, law is silent. You suspend due process. You suspend the Fourth Amendment. Spying becomes au courant. I define war as legalized first-degree murder. You can kill other people not in self-defense. And the fact is, however, no one has a right to rely upon congressional dereliction forever. And it's not a very strong argument to say, well, yeah, I did it illegal, but Johnny did it also, and it wasn't found to be and they didn't hold him accountable.
All right. Now, how has President Trump, in your words, continued to wage or initiate unconstitutional presidential wars? Where?
Sure. Okay. Where? Well, we have our troops fighting war in Iraq. We have them in Somalia. We have them in Libya. We have them in Syria. We have them working in Yemen. We have them with Predator drones in Pakistan. He's fighting war everywhere in the world against Al-Qaeda or ISIS. He's in war in Syria. He pulls some troops. He diminishes the troops one day, sticks them back for oil the next day. But we still are fully engaged in combat, maybe at a little lesser level. And
Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan, yeah, we now have 8,000 troops in Afghanistan. It may go to 10,000. Nobody really knows why they're there. It's a country that we hang in there because we've spent $1 trillion, and when we leave, we know that the incumbent government, like in Vietnam, will fall overnight. And people will ask, what did our troops die for? Why did we spend $1 trillion? There's another element, too, however, that puts, I think, Trump in a little different category than the predecessors. And that is, he said, even though he hasn't acted on it, no, listen, I can drop nukes and destroy North Korea on my own overnight, maybe nuclear winter. I can kill 10 million Afghans if I feel like it, but I'll withhold my power to do that right now. And when you have a statement being so boldly stated as the authority anytime he wants to initiate war on a massive scale, including perhaps even going to war with China over the South China Sea or something, the country is not obligated to wait till the sword of Damocles falls in order to say, wait a minute, we can't trust somebody who's so reckless with the war power to remain in office before we act. It would be like someone walking into your living room and say, I'm not going to kill you, but, I have the right to kill you and all your family if I felt like it. You wouldn't let that person stay in your living room for 30 seconds.
And this is what Mr. Trump meant, I suppose, when he boasted, quote, Article 2 allows me to do whatever I want as president, which, as you point out, is a variation of King Louis XIV of France when he said, quote, I am the state, end quote. Where does Mr. Trump get this interpretation of Article 2? From his attorney general? From the Office of Legal Counsel? Is it accurate, Bruce Fein, that no president in American history has ever made a statement like that?
Mr. Nixon made a statement to Frost that said if the president does it, that means it's not illegal. It's kind of a variation, I suppose. But he even made that statement. He was talking to David Frost after he resigned. But certainly the brazenness in which he's made the statement, I think, exceeds anything any prior president has asserted. And we have a situation where the argument that's made for presidential power, and I want to underscore, I'm not going to put all the blame on Trump, because it's not. It's been accumulating for at least 70 years since Harry Truman, is not by pointing to anything in the Constitution's text or anything in the history of the Constitution. It's simply, presidents have got away with it before, and so we can continue to get away with it. And that's not really an argument of law. That's an argument of raw political power, I suppose. That is an earmark of constitutional lawlessness. And I underscore the reason why the Declare War Clause is so important is because in times of war, the law just is silent. No court really ever stops the president from doing whatever they want. As James Madison wrote, the instruments of power initially engineered to fight foreign danger come back domestically and destroy liberty at home. And that's exactly what we've seen, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, due process violations abroad. They come back here in the United States. We don't have any privacy anymore. The government surveils us at will.
And this kind of expansive lawlessness by the president and prior presidents fuels the American empire, and eventually all empires devour themselves. They devour the nation from which they spring.
And that is count 11 in the impeachment of Donald Trump, violation of the Declare War Clause. Join us again for count 12, violation of the Due Process Clause.